Hey everybody, Dan here with Hardly Brief Tutorials. Today we're going to be starting our player movement and our player controls. What I've done to make this section a little bit easier is made several videos, each video covering a different topic of our player movement. In this very first video, we're going to explore horizontal movement. We're going to set our character up, set our controller and keyboard up so that we can do that. In the next video, we're going to explore crouching. How can our player crouch and get around objects that make the character to squeeze through? We're going to look at how we can look and detect what's above our head. After that, we're going to explore jumping. We're going to look at how can we detect, using what we learned from crouching, how can we detect what's below us, what's on the ground or what is ground, and then how can we project ourselves up in the air, and then we're going to add a double jump to that just to add a little bit more movement. After jumping, we're going to look at our first special move, which is slamming. We want our character to slam to the ground. And if you see on the screen here, our character's turning red, slamming to the ground. That's our first special ability. It's pretty easy, but we're going to add that to the game as well. After that, we're going to look at how we can interact with objects. So I created this building that you see on screen here. Our player jumps up to it. We have an icon that comes up, says press X to interact. We press X, and the building changes from red to green. That's just showing that we actually have interactions working, and that's what we're going to add before our last video. And then in the last video, we are going to actually implement the infinite running part of this tutorial, where we're going to pass through that pink collider that you see on the screen, and it's going to immediately take control of our character. It's going to force us to go a certain speed. We're going to disable some of the controls that we created over the last several videos and actually enable a new set of controls that are special to the infinite running part. So if that all sounds interesting to you, please like and subscribe, and let's get started. Okay, I'm in the project that we started last time where we have the world generation. If I go ahead and press play, jump back in the scene view, you can see that we're still generating all those pieces that we created last time. But we actually don't need to do that in this video or even in the next several videos. So I'm going to highlight world piece parent, and I'm going to hit the checkbox on the right just to turn that off so we're not generating that anymore. The other thing I've gone ahead and done is I've lowered the camera. I've adjusted it so that the green piece in our player is more towards the bottom of the screen, so we have area to kind of play with the movement system that we're going to create. I've also gone ahead and cleaned up the assets folder. I moved the script into the scripts folder, and I've also created a sprites folder. And if you go into that, I have a player standing sprite, which this is important, or this is the sprite that we're going to use in this video, and it'll be available in the description below to download. You can use any sprite you want, though. It's not a necessity for you to use. And the last thing I've done is I've added the Unity input system, and if you've never used that, I'll put a link up in the video now to link to my previous video that I did on the new Unity input system. We're going to be using that to control our character. We're going to be using that to set up player movement using the controller and the keyboard, and you guys can decide on which one you want to keep for your game. But let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we want to do is, after we've turned off our world piece spawner, we want to play with our character. We want to add a few things to it. The first thing, we're going to actually remove the sprite renderer. So I click the three dots. I'm going to click remove component. I'm going to right click on my player, and I'm actually going to add a new 2D object of sprite, and I'm going to just change it to sprite. Now the reason why I want to do this is we want all the controlling and movement on the player, but we want to have another object that handles our sprite and our images. So that's why I've done this. We can go into our sprites folder once you have it and actually move our player standing sprite to the sprite renderer we just added. And the first thing we want to do is actually readjust the scale. So if we go back to our player, I'm going to set our scale back to 1 and 1, so we have the full size of the sprite that I created. I'm going to move my player up just a bit. And now we need to change some settings of our sprite, and this is a pretty important step for crouching, which we're going to do in the next video. If you don't do this, it's going to act a little funky. So in the inspector, when you click on the sprite, you see this pivot, and what you want to do is change the pivot back to bottom. So the pivot point, instead of being in the center of the object, will be on the bottom of the object. We'll click apply. Those settings will adjust. Our player is going to move up a bit, and you'll really notice this change once we add the box collider to it. So now we're going to do that. So in this tutorial, in this series for this controller, we're going to use the rigid body 2D. So if we click add component, we're going to type in rigid body 2D. We're going to keep the body type as dynamic, meaning we're going to actually apply physics to the rigid body in code. We want to change the collision detection to continuous. This takes a little bit more power from the CPU, but it's going to give us better collision information or more continuous collision information. And lastly, we want to turn interpolate to actually interpolate. And then we're going to add another component. We need some sort of collider. So we need a collider that will allow us to one, detect collisions, and then allow us to also detect triggers. So we're going to add a box collider 2D to this. If your sprite's a little different, you can add a custom collider to it, or a polygon collider, or a capsule collider is another popular one. We're going to keep a box one for now. But what I want to draw your attention to now is the collider here. It's highlighted in green, or it's outlined in green, excuse me, and it's centered around the pivot point that we set for our sprite, which is on the bottom. And we need to adjust that. So what we're going to do is in our collider, you can actually click this box, edit collider, and drag the boxes around, or you can manually adjust the numbers. I'm just going to use the edit collider, and I'm going to slide this up to kind of surround my player. Doesn't have to be perfect. You can adjust it going forward. Just get it somewhere usable for now. So there, we have our player set up, we have our sprite set up, we've added a rigid body, we've added a box collider. So now we need to begin doing some coding. I'm going to load up Visual Code, and that's what we're going to work on. The first thing we're going to look at is the player movement script. So let me go back into Unity, go to Assets, I'm going to go into my scripts folder, I'm going to right click, create a new folder, and we're going to create a player movement. We'll create a player folder. And in that, we're going to create a new C# script, and we'll call it player movement. And this is going to control like the physics of everything. I'm going to double click that, open that up into Visual Code, and that's what we're going to work on. So the first thing we want to add are a couple private variables that allow us to store and use the information. I'm going to delete these Unity functions, built-in functions. We are going to use some of them, but not all of them. The first thing we want to do is make a private rigid body 2D, and this is going to be the reference to our rigid body, so I'm just going to call it rigid body. Make sure it's a capital B, otherwise you're going to be hiding an inherited member from another class. You can name it something else. You can do player rigid body if you want, but if you keep the same naming I do, make sure it's a capital B. The other thing we're going to do is make a private box collider 2D. We want to get reference to our box collider, and we'll just call this player collider. And lastly, for this video, we're going to set some stuff up for speed, we're going to set a couple private variables for speed. So we're going to say speed, and we're going to do a public float max speed, or we'll just call it speed for now. And then we're going to do a public float max fall speed. So we want to restrict how fast our player is going to fall eventually once we start jumping and stuff, or if you fall off a big cliff. We don't want the player to go infinitely fast. So we're going to actually set a maximum fall speed. And just for the sake of this, I'm just going to set speed to 10 and our max fall speed to -30. These are just kind of variables that I came up, or numbers that in the before I coded this that I kind of felt comfortable with. They worked pretty well. And above this, we're actually going to use a header. So in the inspector, this will stand out more. So we're going to say header, and then parentheses, quotations, and we're going to say speed info. And this is just a thing to make it look a little bit more organized within the inspector. Lastly, we need one more check. We need one more private variable to use, and that's going to be a velocity on our x-axis. So we're going to say private float, and we're going to label it velocity x. And we don't need to set anything to that right now. We're going to manipulate that lower in the code. So now that we have these private variables, rigid body and box collider, we need to actually get instances of them. We need to cache them somehow. So we're going to do that on the awake method. So we're going to say void awake, and on awake we're going to say rigid body is going to be equal to this.getComponent, and we're going to say rigid body 2D. So this is going to give us the instance of the component that's attached to this game object. Then we're going to say player collider is equal to this.getComponent, and we're going to say box collider 2D because that's the type of collider that we've attached. If you've attached a capsule collider, excuse me, or another type of collider, then you're going to want to say that here as well as up here. But since we've used a box collider, that's what we're going to do. So now to get our player moving is pretty simple. If we go into here and we say player rigid body, we want to go into a fixed update. So when you manipulate a rigid body, you want to do it in the fixed update. That means this happens at the end. This will be fired at the end of every frame. And this is good for physics movement. So we're going to say rigid body dot velocity, and we're going to set this equal to a new vector 2. So because we're in 2D space, we don't have a 3D vector with XYZ to move our character. We have a vector 2, so just X and Y position. And in this case, horizontal movement is our X axis. So we're going to move on the X axis. We're going to set our velocity on the X axis so that we can move left and right. So we're going to use that private variable velocity X. And we're going to set as our X value for our new vector. And then our Y value is just going to be whatever our current rigid body velocity.y is set to. So if we're falling, if we're jumping, it's going to keep that. We're not actually going to manipulate that yet in this video. The other thing we want to do is actually set our velocity X to something. So right now, let me get my semicolon in there. So right now, our velocity X is nothing, right? We've declared it, but we've not set it to anything. So in our fixed update, we're just going to set a constant speed to it, and we're going to say speed, which is the variable that we have. So in this case, this is going to, once we go back in Unity and press play, this should only allow our character to move in one direction, which is the speed that we set, which is 10. So I'm going to control S to save. We're going to go into Unity, and we should see that working. So if I press play, I need to attach the script. So click our player. I'm going to click add component, and we're going to say player movement, which is the script we just wrote. I'm going to collapse these, and we'll see we have speed info. This is the header that we created, speed and max fall speed. I'm going to click play, and our character should just fly off to the right, as it does. So you might have noticed, let me slow this down. There's a couple things we need to adjust. So our player falls, and now it's moving to the right. That's great. But one thing it did is when we press play, the player kind of rotated down. And we want to constrain that. We don't want the player to just rotate all the time unless we tell it to rotate. So in our rigid body, there's this header called constraints. And if you click that, we're going to freeze our position. We're going to freeze our rotation on Z. And we're going to allow X and Y to occur. So now if I press play, you're not going to see this player rotate anymore. It's just going to fall, which is exactly what we want in this case. But if you notice, we don't have any controls. We can't actually control our character, and that's what we need to do. We don't want our player just to continuously move to the right in this instance. We want to be able to move him around. So what we need to do is in our assets folder, we can go into, we'll go into scripts, we'll go back in our player, and we're going to right click, and we'll go to create, and we're going to create a new input actions asset, and we're going to call this game controls. So again, if you haven't seen this, I'll link this in the video now. I have a video tutorial on how to set all this up. Okay, so we have the game controls asset. Now we need to actually add the ability to use our controller or use our keyboard to manipulate our character. So I'm going to double click on game controls. It's going to open up this new window, and the first thing we need to do is create an action map. So we're going to have an action map of just player controls, and then later what we're going to do is create another one for while the player's running. But for now we'll just do player controls. We're going to hit enter, and our new action, we're going to label this left stick, or you can just do horizontal. We'll actually call it horizontal. And then this action type is going to be a value. We're going to click stick. And then when we go to bindings, we want to add a binding that is the left stick. So I'm going to hit listen. I'm going to move my left stick on my gamepad, which you see here. It showed up. And now we want to add our keyboard. So we're actually going to add another binding, and we're going to add 2D vector composite. This is going to allow us to add our keyboard. So A and D for our left and right. And what I'm going to do is find left. I'm going to click binding or the path, hit left on the keyboard or A, and then I'm going to do right, click path, listen. I'm going to hit the D on the pad, and now we have A and D working so that we can actually manipulate our horizontal movement. I'm going to check the auto save box so this saves every time we change it. And I'm going to exit out of this. I'm going to click generate C# class and hit apply. This will create a auto generated script for us called player movement. Or excuse me, this will create a script called game controls that we're going to access in a new script that we're going to call player controls. So in our player folder here, we're going to add support for our controller now for left movement. So if we right click, we're going to create a new C# script. We're going to call this player controls. Double click that, open that up in Visual Code, and we are going to set this up so we can get access to our controls. So I'm going to delete all this for now. The first thing we're going to do is get a private instance of our game controls, which is the auto-generated script that Remedy made, or excuse me, not Remedy, that Unity made, and we're going to call this controls. I'm going to create a public vector2, which we'll call player direction, this is going to be the vector2 that we're going to get from our analog stick or the A and D keys. And we're going to do a get and then a private set. So the reason why we're doing this is that we want to access this player direction in another script, in our player movement script. So we're going to allow access to it, but only read access. We don't want another script to be able to set this value, which is why we labeled it a private set. So now that we have those two down, we're going to use the awake method. And so we'll say void awake. And the first thing we need to do is create a new instance of our control, our game controls. So we're going to say controls is equal to a new game controls. And then now we have access to what we just did. We can actually assign some values and do some things. So we want to do controls.playercontrols.horizontal, because that's the movement we're looking for. And we're going to use the event called .performed and .canceled. Again, if you haven't seen that, check out that video. It's pretty good. And we're going to set that plus equals to context, or lambda, and we're going to say player direction, and we're going to set player direction equal to context.readValue, and we're going to be reading a vector2, so an x and y coordinate. So as I'm moving the stick, or as you're hitting A and D, this player direction value is going to have an x and y number, and it's going to adjust from -1 all the way to 1. And then when we let go of the stick, or if we stop pressing the control, we want to set that vector back to 0. So the way we do that is we're going to say controls players controls.horizontal dot canceled. So when we let go of it, this is going to fire, and we're going to say context lambda is equal to player direction is equal to vector2.0. So this is going to set the vector back to 0, 0. And that's all we really need. Oh, actually, I'm missing one thing. So the other thing we actually need to do is enable these controls, which we're going to dive more into later. But the first thing we'll do is say on enable. So when this game object's active, we're going to say our controls dot player controls dot enable. We're going to turn them on. Okay, so that should be it for the horizontal movement. Now that we're actually collecting that information, we can go back into our player movement script and use the player direction to manipulate our velocity x. So if I go into my player movement script where we have all of our private variables, I'm going to set another private variable, and we're going to set that equal to our player controls, and we'll just call it player controls. I'm going to double click this variable to copy it, and in our awake method below the player collider, we're going to set player controls is equal to we're going to attach this game object. So we're going to say again this dot get component and player controls. Now we have access to that public variable, the public vector2 player direction, and we can use that to manipulate our velocity and tell us kind of where we're going. So where we have velocity x is equal to speed, we're actually going to say velocity x is equal to player controls, not collider, player controls dot player direction dot x, and then we're going to multiply that value by speed. So what will happen is if we're not moving anything, this x value will be 0, and 0 times a number, which in this case is 10, is 0, so we won't be moving. And that should be it for us to add character movement with our left analog stick or A and D. So let's go into Unity. I'm going to turn my controller on real quick so you can see what I'm doing. Let me move it. And if I go into Unity, I'm going to click our player. I'm going to add component, player controls. Control S to save. Let's change the speed back to 5 maybe. And let's press play and see. I'm going to click A and D on the keyboard. And you can see now we're moving left and right. And I'm going to move to the analog stick, which you can see. I'm moving left and right, and it's moving our character around. So that's the basics of how to set up player movement. We have some collision setup because of our rigid body. We have our character moving around with the controller, and that's what I wanted to cover in this video. If you guys have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave a like, subscribe if you can, share the video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Until next time, I'll talk to you guys later.